So the making of our freedom, the making of this future post-capitalist feminist economy and society and future depends so much on what we do now, right now, and to learn the lessons of our past, both the victories and our failures, but to know them and to look at what it is we're trying to do when we're engaging. Engaging, I see it's the language. I used to stammer as a child, and clearly this is coming back. Economists and are often trained, not just, we've heard throughout this conference about all the different types of economists, all the different types of perspectives. I think both Marx and Chris Hani said something that's really useful about understanding what this is about. That it's about, it's not about these complex theories. It's about the lived reality. And I'm paraphrasing, but it's about our human lives, about our land and our homes and the food we eat and the air we breathe and the water we drink and the education that is there or is not there. It's about what kind of work we do and what is regarded and valued as work. In 1994, in Parliament's budget debates, I proposed something that's become known as South Africa's Women's Budget Initiative, or gender-responsive budgeting. And it was about an attempt not to set up a separate budget, but to look at the economic policy choices that inform the entire budget and inform the macroeconomic policy choices that result in the size of the budget itself. What are the sources of income? Who are we taxing? Are we taxing the poor or are we taxing the rich? What kind of policies are we choosing that constrain the resources we have? In 1994, we inherited an apartheid budget, a certain amount of money. And then we were coming in, an apartheid budget that was geared towards less than 2 million people. And then we were expected to actually ensure that that budget in 1994 was going to cater for approximately 42 million people. So what were the macroeconomic policy choices that informed that? And who was being prioritized and what was being prioritized? And whose lives were being valued and whose work was being valued? Were critical questions. And one of the things that we done was to look at, there was the Beijing conference. And in 1994, I was given a copy of the report that had been done for that conference. And the report had been done by apartheid-era bureaucrats. And that report omitted black women in South Africa's homelands and informals and so-called self-government territories. It omitted completely. How do you write a report on the status of South Africa's women and omit almost 1/5 of South Africa's population. So one of the big things was to try to actually get government to change statistics. So I worked on the finance committee, and we set up something called economics or macroeconomics, gender and macroeconomics group that tried to actually push to get this information from Stats SA. And I remember the DG of State Expenditure saying, you know, if you want to address questions of poverty and inequality, and especially of women, you're in the wrong committee. His name was Hannes Smith, I think. And he said, you should go to the welfare committee. So that's where this is supposed to be dealt with. Now, South Africa became known widely for this initiative around the women's budget, because it managed to get a significant commitment from government itself. Because what we'd secured was changes to the minister's speech. So we'd got in the minister's speech 3 commitments to things such as disaggregated data. So for the first time, to collect statistics around women's lives, to collect statistics on women's unpaid labor. So we looked at what was happening elsewhere, what was needed in South Africa. For the first time then that happened, to some extent. To a greater extent, there were statistics being kept. And there were certain shifts that were very significant. And in the 98-99 budget, we got clear commitments. This will change, this will change, this will change. So for example, the Working for Water program said you'd have about 60% of all jobs created would go to women workers. There would be flexible work, etc., in rural areas. So, and that resulted in over half the jobs created in that period going to women in rural areas. But these were limited. These were limited changes because they were not addressing the system and the structure which was intact. And so the women's budget became globally a wonderful technical exercise for everyone from the IMF to the World Bank, everywhere. It was the new buzzword. So the question of co-option of the strategies that we initiate and the revolutionary vision of that strategy and how to maintain that is one of the questions I'd like to put out here. How do we maintain that? The second is the need for movements. And so before 1994, we'd had a massive campaign through the Women's National Coalition that brought together about 19 national organizations and hundreds of local organizations across the country. And so everything, and we had a campaign around 5 key issues, including women and work, violence against women, etc., etc., women and land, resources, etc. So it was AA and women's legal status. So anyway, so there were these issues which women very creatively mobilized around the country. And that campaign, one of the partners was the Rural Women's Movement. And they very powerfully came to Parliament, came to CODESA, and fought against the traditional leaders who were arguing for in terms of customary law, to actually inhibit the rights of rural women, to access to land, to equality. And that mobilizing pushed rights onto the agenda of rural women. But the problem is this here, that you can have that happening a couple of years down the line, we succeed. We have the Joint Monitoring Committee on the Quality of Life and Status of Women. We develop a set of priority laws. We get 80% of those laws enacted, which was quite significant in terms of everything from Domestic Violence Act to changes to the labor law in terms of women's rights. Fast forward to the present day, and the issue of what's happening to women in terms of Clara, the communal land, and the traditional, okay, I have it all written down, traditional Kotzebue, and the reinstatement of apartheid-era tribal authorities. That happens. So the question of how you can move forward and then how you can go back. And the only thing, and Myrtle is here, and Myrtle will talk about the issue, I'm sure, about what's happened to women workers. And you've heard it throughout the sessions. The fact that the majority of women workers today form the majority of the working poor. So what do you do about that? And the question is then, how do you build movements? Who are the organizations that have come up? Which are the movements that have arisen that will begin to bring their power together in solidarity across division? What would the students, what would the women working in rural areas on farms, what would, so etc. How would you identify? Who are those organizations? Who are those? How would they come together? On what principled basis would they come together? And I want to put that very clearly. What is the principled basis on which women come together? And there must be clarity on the agenda. What is that agenda that unites us and informs economic policy choices, etc.? So I want to end this. Sorry, I'm going to ask Rukia. I don't know about the time I have, but I had done a paper for Parliament. Parliament's doing a series of booklets or books on personal recollections of MPs and former MPs who are part of the constitution-making process. And a lot of what I've said is contained in this paper. It's 10 pages. And I'm going to make sure that I email it to Rukia, and whoever would like it, it can be circulated. But I want to end with something from Love and Courage. In Alexandra Kolantai's book, Love of Worker Bees, which told the personal stories of women asserting their freedom in early Soviet Russia, Kolantai became Commissar for Social Welfare in Lenin's government and used her power to advance the interests of the poorest women, ensuring that the Soviet government committed itself to clinics, nurseries, and maternity homes, female suffrage, legal equality, free divorce, free abortion, 2 months paid maternity leave, workplace and community pressures, and a law against wife beating. However, these victories were overturned when Stalin came to power and introduced anti-abortion and anti-homosexual laws. He introduced the order of maternal glory for mothers who had 7 or more children. Okay, so I just stop there. And just ask, you with the question of what that implies for what we do now in envisaging this future that is post-capitalist, anti-capitalist, that is a feminist future, that understands our relationship to the earth, that understands and values our relationship to each other, and that enables us to live as we fight the struggle, to live as free human beings. Thank you.
Thanks, Prex. We'll circulate the paper, and I'm sure it'll add to what will certainly be ongoing debates about, building visions. And I think if there's any issue in addition that you think is worth highlighting in the paper that people should look out for, then there'll be opportunity for that. I want to invite Salima at this point. I don't know if everybody who's here listened to Salima's presentation. She describes herself as an eco-feminist, eco-socialist feminist. What is the order?
I didn't think I defined myself.
Okay, so we've just defined her. And the people have spoken, she shall have to accept the label. And of course, much more interestingly, a poet. I know that you have been thinking a lot about this question, particularly from, like an eco-feminist perspective, and I think it would be interesting to hear some of your perspectives that you think are critical for this imagining.
Great, thank you.
There's something wrong with the mic.
Yeah, this is what I was
We are
feeling.
struggling and suffering.
It's echoing or something?
Oh, it's the
Yeah, what about, is this better if I hold it further away?
Yes.
That was better.
Can I just ask something? Yesterday, this session, this stream, was the only stream that didn't have a roving mic. It's a very interesting thing. It's also about, the Joint Monitoring Committee on the Quality of Life and Status of Women in Parliament had the lowest budget.
Does it sound better if I? Does it sound better if I go further? That's okay.
Otherwise, people can use that one.
I think I'd like to actually respond directly to what we just heard from Craig's, and it's not the first time I'm hearing these questions, right? And I want to contextualize South African independence, which is what I call it, 1994, in time, because economists don't talk much about time, and that's why at the beginning of this stream I emphasized history. And if you don't account for time, then the same economic policy that worked in one moment will not work in the other, because you're not looking at all the other things that happened in the particular moments that you're discussing. So, South Africa was the last country in the continent to become independent, and unlike virtually all the rest, it was a moment when the notion globally of governments acting within the economy to somehow account for the majority of the population, which may be left out by capitalists, was gone. So the kinds of policies that you brought in, whether it was the women's budget, whether it was social grants, it was within a frame of a world where the needs of the majority no longer mattered. And I think Professor last night was talking about that, right? I mean, he was talking about how they used to call it the social welfare function. That's what economists call it. So in the 60s, when the first round of independence came in the continent, that was the first definition for government. What is the social welfare function? Then you bring in other areas of economic policy. You didn't have that in this country. I think partly you gave in easily to a neoliberal paradigm, And also, you didn't actually deconstruct the capitalism that you had before independence enough so as to think about restructuring the economy. So when we talk here about feminist economics, and in our last session of this stream, the topic was neoliberalism as the new sexism. And really the whole time, who was here for that one? Certain number of you, right? Not many. Okay. Really what we did there is we described how much worse it has been for women since the, let's say, mid-80s globally and in this country. And then there really wasn't much rethinking that went on. And it brought me to 3 points. If we want to construct a socialist feminist economy, or if we want to change things in this country, I think there's 3 areas that we need to think creatively in. So, we need to move from analyzing neoliberalism, right, which is being done everywhere, to actually understanding the failures of capitalism. Because neoliberalism is another moment of world capitalism. It came from the 1980s onward. Why? Because of contradictions in the capitalism of the 1950s until the mid-80s. We need to understand what those contradictions were on a national scale, right? It varies from country to country. There are certain patterns that you can find in Africa, Asia, Latin America. There's other patterns in the richer parts of the world. But they all revolve around contradictions of capitalism. And really the global elite, whether it's states and capitalists together or separately, they chose a whole new approach. They got rid of that social welfare function. It was a political choice. And so we need to understand how they got there. That's how we can start building the new, right? I think we need to move from this protection that we feel with legislation and the goal of legal protection toward democratizing economic decision making. I think that's what we need to be formulating. How do we democratize economic decision making? So rather than going to the state with all this legal language and then being upset because it's not enforced, there isn't enough regulation to allow the enforcement, we actually just blow the paradigm, right? Because of course the legal structure is another part of capitalism. Marx called it the superstructure. And we can have the best laws, but if you don't change the structure of the economy, which is what happened in this country after 94, those laws won't change much. The other thing that we need to let go of, I think, is this, and this is economists in particular, I think other people who study the economy have let go a long time ago, is this notion of informal and formal. So if we just make the informal formal, things will be solved. You know, if you take a historical approach to capitalism, like I was talking about yesterday, you would actually say that all those forms that are called informal were incorporated in the world economy starting from the 15th century. Capitalism used them. Jayati in this last panel talked about capitalism as an octopus. It reaches, it takes anything and moves it to its purpose. And so if you think about debt peonage in Central America when Columbus arrived there, that was articulated into the profit motive. And maybe it spun around many times, between the silver mines and the markets in China where the European merchants were selling the silver because that's where they needed it, well, then you would know that debt peonage is not an informal economy. It's very much part of the formal economy. And here in this country, you know it well, because the so-called homelands were you could say, I mean, the standard economists will say that was the informal, and then the mines were the formal. But we know they were completely intertwined in every way, from women's labor to feeding the family, reproducing the labor force, caring for the sick miner when he loses the job, and then finding the new labor to replace him. So we need to let go of those distinctions and the battles around them, right? Because if we formalize sex work, is that going to change it? The relations are exactly the same. You still have the John, you still have the, who's the other guy? The pimp. Oh, then we'll need regulators. Oh, but in neoliberalism we don't have a government to regulate. So from there, what I think we need to do, which is what Mazibubo said in the discussion yesterday, it is about redefining work, production, and all of that includes nature, right? So-called nature, which is our own nature and the nature around us that we are part of. That is the creative work we need to do to really rethink economy. Now, how we do that is another question, because Sipo told us last night that we can't leave the economic decision making to Treasury. Jayati said we can't leave figuring out the economy to economists. And justice is another whole area of expertise that we have to combine. So I think there's a process that we have to think about in terms of doing this reflective work, and then there's another process where we actually try to build on that reflection with the average person.
Thank you. So I'm going to go straight ahead, because what I'm hoping will happen is that we can expand the threads a little bit. And then I think we do need to look at the question of, so what are we going to do with all of this? And I think some of that is coming out. I'm going to invite Buyo to share, I think, a few things that came up for her, both in the session she was facilitating, but generally, that add to the debate and give the kind of background to what then comes here.
Thank you, Sipo. So I guess I'll start by reiterating what has been a constant thread through all of the sessions that I have sat in. I'll start with repeating that economic decisions are political, and that the political is personal or the personal is political. So that's where the focus of our discussion earlier on in the session today was really about bringing out our personal political into the discussions and into the discourse. And Bertha and Constance shared their stories and about how they interact with the economy, and that's where the topic of sex work, what is labor, what is production, who contributes capital, what is investment, and all of those things came about in the discussions regarding sex work and in the informal economy. And as we've been discussing, the informal economy subsidizes the formal economy. Even in the second last session, where we were talking about different ways of banking and different banking systems, and how informal financial savings or investments, such as the stokvel, last year generated like 60 billion in 60 billion was spent from stock sales in December last year in like 1 week. But that's not seen as like a formal financial savings system. So it's things like that about how those informal systems continue to subsidize formal systems, about how unpaid work and unpaid care work, or whichever way you put it, contributes to the formal work or the real work that is done and enables that kind of work to happen. So, and this is something that will never come out in how the economists, so the pale white men in suits, articulate productive economic labor. And so that is something that doesn't really come out, and I think that's one of the reasons why it was so important to have those narratives within our dialogue and our discussion, and to center them in how we reimagine and how we think of the economy. And I mean, so I'm a funky millennial, so I use pop culture references into this discussion. So Scandal, the series, there was one episode where it's called The Fixer here in South Africa. So in The Fixer, Papa Pope once said something to Olivia Pope that I will never forget. So Olivia Pope was like the lead badass black woman who was just like, yeah, she was all of those things, yeah. So Papa Pope once said to Olivia, you have to work twice as hard to prove that you're half as good. And no, I felt that. And it was just so true, and it's how things are. And being a black woman in this kind of like economic environment, in this kind of society, we work twice as hard to overcome our imposter syndromes, to prove that we also have a rightful place at this table, that what we say, we are constantly validating our existence, constantly validating our knowledge, because of the fact that the current system that we're in is not conducive to be accommodating and to just be accepting without proving that what we're saying is valid and what we're saying is just. And I think for me, a post-capitalist feminist economy is one that will rehumanize, what will re-womanize what is currently an anti-black, an anti-woman, and an anti-poor global system. So for me, that's what a post-capitalist economy will look like.
All right, so I want to invite Lebohang, who has, I'm hoping will draw on the work she has done over I don't know how many decades now, where I think she's both been part of a project, and by that I mean a political project, to unpack some of these issues, right? These kind of very nuances, and from both a historical and of course very deeply Pan-Africanist perspective, about what this kind of capitalist system is about and how it's shaping lives. So at this point, if you want to come in, I guess, yes.
Thanks, Seppo. Thanks, Sistrian, and a couple of brethren, I guess. I haven't thought this through very clearly, but I have got some instinctive resonances with all of the sisters here. The one is that the history of oppression and the history of women's oppression is linked in with the history of capitalism.
The history of capitalism. The history of capitalism in all of its forms. And I've been saying for many years that it keeps on mutating, it keeps on recreating. It has an instinct, a rapacious, greedy instinct to keep on recreating itself. And it will continue to do so because it has its own ways of reconfiguring. So the end of global apartheid as we knew it in 1994 here was really not the end of anything in particular. It was a recreation and a reconfiguration. It was a regathering of global forces. And it's placed South Africa in this weird, uncomfortable, untenable, I think, situation of being this special project of an African country on the African continent. What this also means is that, secondly, women as global, women as surplus labor that is malleable, that is movable, that is seen to be more vulnerable and seen to be more slightly easier to mess around with in political spaces, in policy discourses, in political dialogues as well, and mainly in the economy, which is my primary playground. There's a conflation between the way that we have begun to configure global power and women's power. The project of capitalism will always need, and global, whatever you want to call it, globalization, global capitalism, it will always need something really simple. It will always need people in order to drive it. In the previous panel that I was sitting on, I made a case which I'm going to repeat here, which is that I think that women's labor today is very much the equivalent of what drove what was called the transatlantic slave trade, transatlantic human trafficking. But basically a group of people who are disposable to global capitalism. If you can't get somebody who is going to be willing to work cheap, don't worry. There'll always be somebody who can work cheaper. For most of us who work in, who have to travel to Europe at any given time, or travel to different parts of the world, it's always interesting to me to be in Belgium and watch a woman with brown hands making my bed in a white person's country. It's bizarre. And yet this is I think that this is because the whole project of global capital and globalization is linked in, and it's the descendant of, or the continuation of, the very same transatlantic human trafficking. And we're still trafficking, whether it's skills, people, culture, pop culture, and others. We're still trafficking more of the same. In closing, I also wanted to say this. And it's a leftover from what I didn't finish saying yesterday.
Pay up time.
Pay that time, baby. But basically, I wanted to say that a post-feminist or a post-capitalist economy is one that understands human provisioning, one that understands human nurturing, one that recognizes that nurturing is not soft, fluffy stuff. That care provisioning is not for those who are soft, it's for those who are strong. It's actually for those who are the anchor of our communities. The significance of unpaid work to the functioning of national and international economy is priceless. If we were to go back to the beginning of history and to the beginning of her story, quantify and qualify the amount of unpaid, unseen, unrecognized labor that women have conducted, there would not be enough money in any bank to begin to restitute that. And I think that there's a case to be made for a post-capitalist reparation for women's work. And that's probably the kind of project we need to think of. A reparation for the work that we do. And whether that is housed in gender budgeting, whether that is housed in new forms of policy, whether that is housed in reframing the way we do work. I'd love a situation where I'm able to say, because my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother worked so damn hard, I don't have to work anymore. Amen. Neither will any of my daughters. I can work and rethink. I can work at the things that I enjoy. I can work at being a poet. I can work at studying Russian because I feel like it. I can improve my Yoruba and my Swahili. And that can be a thing that is my entitlement, and I get paid to do it. Why not? So I think that we need to think about a project which thinks about the reparation of women's work and quantifying that. Let's give ourselves that kind of homework to do. The second thing that I think would be a concrete thing is the link between women's work and the global ecology, planetary ecology. So this environment, not only, I think there's a correlation between the health of the planet and the health of women, directly. When the earth bleeds, when the earth is traumatized, I believe that it's a reflection of women's trauma, women's pain, and women's bleeding. So the fact that the planet is so angry right now is something to do with the pain and the aggregated suffering of many, many generations and millennia of women's pain and suffering. I mean, I think most of us are aware of this whole notion that we carry pain intergenerationally in ourselves. So this whole notion, this whole idea that, oh, slavery is over, get over it, jump up and down. Apartheid is over, get over it, forget about it. It's never really over. It's never really undone. You cannot undo and forget intentionally that which was done and intentionally done to you. That's an oxymoron. How does that work? I beat you up, poof, blue eye. Ah, forget about it, get over it. Get over that blue eye. How does that actually work? How do you undo that which was done? And the demand comes from the one who is the systemic abuser. What's that about? And then lastly, that the health of the earth is vital to our social reproduction, and that we as women in a post-capitalist world are the health of the earth. I think that's all I can say.
Great. So I'm going to ask Pumi to add to the thread, and then we're going to spend a few minutes talking about practically.
I will start the sermon.
Thanks for this.
So you want to use the mic?
Should I? Can you hear me?
In front of you. Don't hold
I
it,
think
just
for
put
the
it down.
recording.
I'm also like big ups, you know, for my sisters who worked so hard to defend the importance of having the stream, and everyone who's contributed in actually making it the beauty that it was. Now, I'm not a pessimist, I'm a real optimist person, so I'm very happy that this session in many ways is going to build and take us somewhere. Here are some of the things to add on this important task that everyone has already spoken about. For me, what came up in this stream, almost in every panel, also elevated some of our contradictions when we talk about feminist economies. I think we need to lift them up so that we don't assume that we are on the same page and we are going to forge the revolution. You know, I think that is important. For me to be one of the first tasks. Well, you don't know that Rukia agreed that we are doing study circles across the country with Oxfam and Jess. You'll get the report on Monday. But that's one of the things we agreed about.
And the bill.
But it should not be the only thing, but it should be a task so that when we get what Pregs has authored, when we read like the presentations, however we are systematizing this thing, we are able to actually deepen what it means for our feminist proposals. That's one. The second thing is then how do we deal and live with the discomforts and tensions that exist in those proposals as we go forward. We have to find a way to deal with it. One such thing, the debate was, I want to become a I want to become an entrepreneur that may make me embrace capitalistic values. Because I do think that it is important that as a black woman I get economic freedom and emancipation. Now, one of the crucial things that feminists and feminist economists put forward is the move away from an individual approach to a societal approach, to move away from envisioning that this is for the emancipation of women, but this is for the emancipation of all excluded, where women play a critical role. You see the shift on that. So we have to confront those issues to be able to define. Now the other thing that we have to deal with is that the revolution is not going to wait, you know, or rather, capitalism is not going to wait for the revolution to happen, right? in this moment, and as I asked Jayat in the last session to reflect on BRICS, for example, BRICS is one model. And many of us have tensions around how to engage, to put it mildly, how to engage or not engage with BRICS. And yet, as she was saying, is that it provides a space. I have to sleep on this. It provides a space, right, in which we can say, right now, in the minimum ways we can actually put policy in place that even in this uncomfortable, horrible situation can help in some ways to shift the realities. This is how we will engage. So not to diss everything that is in place, but to actually collectively be able to define how we can better engage in a situation. Yeah. I hope that makes sense. Now there is a permanent task that we have. It's thinking about alternatives and trying and testing them. If a revolution of trying and testing an alternative is happening in Lusikisi, it's okay. That's what I learned from the Zapatistas in Chiapas. Women, they are doing amazing things in just that community space. They are living their alternative, you know? We need to try and see how we can support, help build, or even catalyze those alternatives in our communities. I'm from Guatemala. I'd like to see something like that happen. So that I don't go there. Today is Ego Ruleni Pride March in Guatemala. I'm missing. I'd like to know that it is not just about the consumerism of lesbians and gays and trans people that is the expression of why I should be proud as a lesbian person. You see? So that in our communities, the types of challenges against capitalism that we talk about, we begin to actually make sure that they are understood by my mother. Why not doing something that she would not imagine, because she doesn't come to these discussions that we have, but something that she can embrace and do that alternative. You know, we don't talk about, we didn't depend very much, but we are in a serious crisis about water, for example. Never mind the other things that we have a crisis with them. And we have a huge task. It's not just going to be about buying igubu to store water. If you're lucky enough to have the money to buy that gubu to store water. We have to think about some of the real life threatening things and what we are going to be. How are we going to survive? What are the things we are going to be putting in place to actually breathe through those things? And of course, everybody who knows me would know that I would not sit down without talking about a movement, picking up from friends. It's a real pity, you know, that there's no women's movement in this country. There are many pockets of important initiatives and work that women are doing. And that is fine, right? That is good, that is important. But we have to make efforts to find one thing. You know, in the manner in which the total shutdown, regardless of the problems that exist with the total shutdown and post-total shutdown thing, but here was one initiative that with all our hang-ups against each other was important. We all went out on the 1st of August in one voice to say no, and without the men, right? We have to find that one single thing on the economy that we can say, this is one thing that can unite us. It's a pity that the violence focus was very GBV, like you beat me up and what. We didn't think about how capitalism is violent, for example. Right? This was one of the things I was saying, that it's pity that it was like that. But we have to find one thing, you know, one thing and one moment in which we can say we can rally around that. That thing, right, is the thing that will help us build a movement. Because otherwise we will be caught up. What did Jayati say? I'm too old to wait for the revolution. Yeah, I feel that way sometimes. But let us find, and Biki Biki, I'm very patient. You know, Biki Biki will get there. So thanks everyone for all your contributions, and I'll be very happy to continue to think and plot and build with all of you. Thank you.
So I know that I promised to give more time, and I think we will take 5 more minutes. Just to hear people who really have a burning proposition that I guess builds on what has begun to be a narrative about what are the different paths forward, who didn't get a chance to be on the table. Anybody who thinks that, for instance, they have an idea for what is that one thing, and how that idea could build on, I guess, the framework that's been articulated by everyone who's spoken about the different layers of work we have to do. But I think taking on board the fact that we don't build a revolution by just thinking about it.
Yes.
And how do we take that into consideration? That it's the thinking and the doing, and it's in the doing that the thinking gets refined.
I believe that there are people, and we all know that, there are movements, south-to-south movements, that have actually created a serious dent in the capitalist world. So whether it's someone like Vandana Shiva fighting multinational companies because they want to actually appropriate a particular seed, and she wins on that, even if it's fighting big companies. So I really think that, I don't know where you're going to find the money from, but I really think that the way forward, building on what you have created, is to bring in women who have been doing these things and who have succeeded in whether it's fighting government, multinational companies, changing legislations, whether it's women from Brazil, women from India, and all of those countries. And I think that it's the coming together and finding ways in which, how do we learn from this and how do we build a strong movement? Because you know what? We really also must give ourselves a pat on the back. South Africa is a very, very young democracy. And in terms of people like Pregs, yourselves, whether it is from TAC, you women were in front of actually fighting and winning, whether it was the Women's Coalition that ended up becoming the genderization of our constitution today. So I really think that South African women, black women, need to really give themselves a pat on the back. But there is still more work to be done, and south-to-south coalitions are very important.
Thank you, sister. Building on what the sister said, and because this festival is called Rethinking Economics for Africa, I want to leave the challenge that we must break this this focus on South Africa, which is very problematic. In rethinking, we are rethinking still within the nation-state framework, which I think it seems makes me very worried about our imaginations, particularly about how these borders were constructed. And even as we talk about south-to-south cooperation, I know and I understand that a lot of South Africans are not talking, oh, well, let me talk about Mozambique, or let me talk about Congo. We are talking about South Africa. It's a break in revolutionary circle. Yeah. So this is very concerning to me. So how is it that we're going to rethink, at the same time break the modes of national, sort of restore the Pan-African rethinking, restore the Pan-African movement for an economic revolution, for an economic alternative? I think that's imperial. Because our lives are so connected. I was in Mozambique 2 weeks ago, and last week I'm from Angola, and one of the sisters told me one of the things. She said, you know, here we have a lot of floods, but these floods happen when the Limpopo River, the dams fill up. South Africa opens the doors and fills up Mozambique. In Mozambique, there's a project that they're going to build a dam on the Zambezi River. So now the Zambezi River almost crosses the entire continent. Whatever happens in Mozambique is going to influence Zambia, is going to influence Angola. So we're busy here strategizing for South African black women What about women on the rest of the continent? And I think this exceptionalism really needs to be challenged, because it's the same exceptionalism we see in industry that we see in the social movement.
Thank you all so much for your contributions. It's been a session that has fired me up. So one thing that keeps coming up as a general theme that I'm picking up is that we're operating in silos, right? And I've seen that quite a lot. Like if you go in Khabula, there are women there who are trying to organize around subverting what the traditional court bill has done by centering their children as access to land because they know it's a bargaining tool, right? So it's like, I need this land, not only for me, but if you don't put it in my name, what's gonna happen to my child because the men aren't here? At the same time, you have women in Freedom Park right here occupying land in the evening, but there's no cooperation between the two. And I think the only way for us to build this Pan-African movement, this movement that we want, is we need actual political power. So many times we've organized, if you look at South Africa, like the ANC, whatever, we've never had a political party that's unapologetic about putting the feminist agenda first. The feminist agenda has always been a dream deferred. So you had to be ANC first, we'll get to the women's issues. You're PAC first, we'll get to the women's issues. Where's the political party where we can house our issues? Because once we've done that, we're the majority in this country. Like, we can get the vote. We need to, I can't imagine any kind of post-capitalist, post-patriarchy, anything, without us practically using that system of political power and mobilizing around that. Until we have a feminist political home, we'll carry on in silos. You know, you gave the example of the Zapatistas. Right now, they're actually being commercialized a bit through how people are traveling because of the myth of what it is they've done, you know? And also that operates in a silo in Mexico without any kind of communication. So let me just wrap it up. We need a political party.
I think that so much has been said about feminism and women and equality and things. But I want to believe that 1994, when we went to vote, we didn't go to vote as domestic workers, we went to vote as a woman. We went to vote because we believe changes are going to take place for women. We went to vote because we believe in equality. Today, what we see in reality, we see that women is oppressing women. And that has to change. If we want to change, if we want to really see things happen, we need to respect each other as women. That woman that's working in that kitchen is a woman. She's got the same right and she's got the same feeling as that woman she's working for. And at least we as women are going to change our mindset. How can we free ourselves? How can we believe in feminism? How can we believe in the equality in women? So my belief is that you know, we've got a slogan, our work make all work possible. Because without us, some of you won't be able to sit there today. And I think that is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for that equality and the recognition as women. And if we can do that, yes, together we can change the world. Thank you.
All right. So I think that if there's nobody else who's absolutely burning, I'm going to hand over to the panelists. Well, to the people who kicked us off, to just say maybe just one thing that I think in closing they think is important, and then I'll make a couple of points myself. Anybody who wants to start, particularly in relation to, practically, so I think we all know the work is big, right? And I think what everybody has said in different ways, and I think Pumi crystallized about the fact that, of course we kind of have a generic conception of what, we all need a revolution, but I think the substance of that needs serious interrogation. And I think that Salima spoke to the layers of work we have to do, you know, at conceptual level, but also at a tactical level. And I think, you know, some of the inputs really spoke to, I think, strategies and tactics that I think some of them being kind of immediately possible, and some of them being part of a long-term organizing, movement building process. So, I mean, if anybody wants to kind of just highlight anything in particular that is about way forward. And then I think there's a couple of, I think, commitments that we can certainly make that just, I think, keeps the space, you know, the space for at least dialogue open. So anybody wants to start? Okay.
I think in highlighting something that sticks out in a way of moving forward, not to raise a new issue or to throw a spanner in the works, but I think one of the things that we didn't actually touch on during all of the sessions, and something that Kumi just said now that made me think about that, and I think that's something we need to take on, about how we think about violence and about how we think about capitalism being violent. And how, so I think that we need to sort of start thinking about structural violence and start bringing that out more into our language, into our conversations about the economy and how it acts as a violent structure and what things we need to subvert that. So I think that's something that I just picked up right now, that I think it's something we need to take on and we need to build on and we need to continue to amplify.
Maybe to rethink vocabulary. I'm big on words. I think it's important to collectivize our means of production and think about how this can happen. I think that we should amplify much more the small scale, and in fact it's important not to say small, the invisible, the intangible ways of being that we're already modeling. I also think that it's, in as much as it's important to think about South-South solidarity, I take the young sister's point around kind of other African contexts and the notion of a Pan-African feminist identity. The third thing is how I think that our states are wasting time in relation to regionalism and in relation to state formation. I also think that our states are inherently violent and disinterested in women anyway, because the national question has always been more important than the women's question. So I think that there's an opportunity for us to think around women's solidarity that is cross-border, that is cross-ethnic, and that goes beyond really narrow nationalisms. And lastly, I think that we need to consider much more deliberately building a woman's economic ecosystem, and just be intentional about that. And that's the basic things of the things that BEE is doing in a really wrong, dodgy, terrible, perverse kind of way. But buying from women, supporting black women in business, supporting kind of black women's policy making, and being intentional about the way that we do what we do. And these are not small things. These are huge things. The clothes that we wear. So if we can avoid going to Edgar's and say, no, OCC is going to sew for me, those sorts of things, and building that kind of ecology, that can probably take us a bit further than we are right now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think just in addition to all the points that have been raised, the question of corporations and the power of corporations and how we begin to dismantle that. So whether it's in relation to food and who owns seeds in our country, whether it's in relation to patents and who owns medicines and who blocks the access to affordable medicine, whether it's in relation to water and who owns water. So just a quick example, in Cape Town, during the drought, big bottling companies, including Nestle and Coca-Cola, were bottling Cape Town's water, and it was being sold back to Cape Town's people. And they were making large amounts of profits during the drought, through the drought. So the key issue that I want to raise is the question of our our constitution talks about water, food, education, etc. as rights, as human rights. The General Agreement in Trade and Services talks about all of these as commodities. And we have to find ways to change and challenge that. And I want to just end with just one point. I just tried to get some information.
Our institutional savings in our country, and this is the majority of people in our country, comes to about 7.8 trillion. Now, according to the, sorry, let's get this right, the BE Economics Annual Transformation Survey, there's the biggest players, the biggest companies that hold our savings in our country are Old Mutual, 630 billion, Coronation 500 billion, Investec 470 billion, Allen Gray 460 billion, Sunlum 440 billion. So where are they investing our money? And what control do we have over our money across this country? So perhaps that is an area that we can begin to look at. So just in terms of the breakdown of who manages that, black managers make up about 4% of the life insurance industry of 3 trillion. And that's 24 years since 1994. So just, how do we begin to disaggregate these and challenge them? So the arms deal, I mean, the issue of the people have put a lot of attention on corruption. So as a feminist, for me, the issue of voting against the arms deal preceded the question of the corruption. I assumed that the corruption would follow. The question was the priority. What is our priority, and what's the issue of the systemic violence that signals, and the institutional violence that actually upholds?
I want to pick up on what you said in the beginning of your intervention, sister, and also what we had in the panel before the last here, which is around land. Now, land is a hot issue right now in this country, and I think it would be strategic to use that focus to mobilize women around land issues, but in the way of rethinking. So not a short term, how are we going to use the fight between the ANC and other parties around land, but how are we going to use this to push this rethinking of our relations to each other and to nature?
Yeah.
After we'll go get to the political party.
Yeah. So, I mean, colleagues, I couldn't possibly summarize all that was shared here. Suffice to say that I think there's a very strong basis for us, I think, doing something about, I think, the task that we've identified exists if we are to have the possibility to create the possibility for a future of freedom. And that it's going to be, complex. It's going to be a real exercise in reimagination, whether around, this notion of, what's the ground from which you are doing the imagining? Is it the kind of within the narrow frame of borders and the, kind of narrow frame of the nation state called South Africa? What does solidarity look like? And just kind of unpacking all of these things around what's the frame, right? And not just kind of declaring that we're Pan-Africanist, which is very easy. When having worked, in the Pan-Africanist kind of organizing landscape, it's so complicated to think about how do you actually create something real that is a true expression of Pan-Africanism and what meaningful solidarity means. And so there's a lot of figuring out. There's a lot of kind of that work that has to happen. There's a lot of work, and I think an opportunity just to kind of collate all of the different pieces of knowledge that already exist. And perhaps I'm volunteering some sisters, you know, to just work on that piece of just putting together, I mean, just the conversations of the last 2 days, I think need to be somewhere and need to be synthesized. And I think all of the other richness from which people who've spoken over the last 2 days, you know, we need to kind of find a place for that. And then I think the initiative around, you know, study circles is a very exciting one, you know, that would then link with that, whatever it is we're going to create to have this feminist knowledge just drawn for easy access. And then I think in those circles, I'm imagining that it won't just be kind of reading, it'll be processing for strategy and for movement building. And then I think in relation to the questions about, so I mean, some of us, you know, won't live long enough for the revolution to come. I speak for myself. So you know, what do we do, you know, now, and what are the tactical kind of opportunities we can leverage? For instance, is it about identifying an issue that seems to be an issue in the moment? Land, you know, has been posed as one. I know there are some feminists who are doing some work together with the domestic workers movement. You know, what kind of thinking can emerge out of that starts to conceptualize solidarity, right? I mean, I heard what Metal was saying. And I think there's like, I think a strong possibility there to not just kind of do the, you know, legalistic kind of stuff and rights, but to start, I think, building a texture to this idea of how women's productive and reproductive work should be made to count and should be counted, and solidarity there. And then, I mean, I think we all have problems with this kind of framing, but I think, you know, the groundwork that's been done around the women's budget is certainly something that presents an opportunity for, I think, learning from what was done, but also deepening the frame, I think, for possibility and making the link with what I think Lebohang was talking about as you know, there is something called like an economy right now, and those who look at money, and thanks Prex for reminding us of this issue about there's big money that's sitting in the system, right? And I think the reality that money is kind of just circulating when it's not just sitting stagnant, it's not circulating in the system to advance the interests of people. And what would it look like for us to talk about this money and to claim it and to start, I think, demanding that it should enable the kind of ecosystem you were referring to. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of possibilities, and I think, again, I mean, we've analyzed, you know, and I think we've been challenged to not just to kind of focus on neoliberalism as a kind of a particular expression of the kind of the larger, older capitalist system. But I think it's also important to remind ourselves as we begin this, well, as we move in this path, that capitalism is in crisis. We're not talking here about a system that's kind of, you know, solid and like confident, and it's so desperate that it, it is trying right now to, to co-opt as many of us and to co-opt as many things, as it can to reproduce itself, because it knows that it's under threat, because it understands that actually people do have power, and that if people decided to exercise that power in the powerful ways that are possible, it can be shook. And so I think it's important to enter into this exercise not being overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude and might of this thing, and to understand that we can come into this with an agency that means that we can imagine a kind of a process of collectivizing our power against the system in ways that are kind of step by step. And I think as people were saying, I mean, we are going to, in this revolutionary path, going to have to make some reformist kind of, tactical choices, and how do we make those choices, be very aware of what we're doing, but understand that, we have a lot of things from a strong basis from which to start. And so I think it's all, for me, very, very exciting. So Pumi and Rukia will take the responsibility for creating, I didn't do this, you did it, you volunteered, for creating like a kind of communication channel for people who want to be part of a communication, so that we can perhaps explore some of these things that we've spoken about as opportunities. I note that there are feminist economists in the room. There's like fabulous, funky millennials who can do funky things. And so I think that we will kind of expect that the two of them and the funky millennium, the three of them actually will communicate to us. And that means that those who want to be communicated to, you might want to leave your contacts to them. And then, we can take it from there. I don't know, Rooks, if there's going to be a report of the festival, whatever, so that people can know where to get that.
Yes.
Yeah?
Absolutely. Every session has been very carefully audio recorded, and Tanaka's been sitting here diligently just recording everything from our stream. And then we have, please remind me, my sister, Lady, that's also come on board to document and pull out the salient things around the kind of feminist economics that we want to
So
that's all going to be available.
And the videography is all going to be available as well.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
And the database.
And the database at registration.
Yeah.
So. But I think that for those who want to kind of continue for this stream, I don't know how do we do that?
Can't we just pass around a list?
Yeah.
Old style.
Old school.
Yeah.
And do you think we could do it electronically?
Yes.
It'll go as quick. Because what happens is when you write it, we get your email address wrong.
Right.
Yeah. And so as you leave, just come and pop it in quick.
All right. Do we want to say that one group of people can come to Naledi and maybe she can just pop things in her beautiful things?
Oh no, I can just open my laptop.
And then so that we can have 3 people so that we don't have a long queue.
Stations.
Stations.